Berlin, 1942. Wehrmacht High Command. The conference room erupted in laughter. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg himself, slammed his hand on the mahogany table, barely able to contain his amusement. Before him lay intelligence photographs of America's newest tank, the M4 Sherman. Around the table, other German officers leaned in, their faces twisted in smirks of superiority. "This?" Guderian said, tapping the photograph with his finger. "This is what the Americans plan to defeat us with?" The Sherman weighed 33 tons. Germany's Panther? 45 tons. The Tiger? A monstrous 57 tons. But it wasn't just the weight that made the Germans laugh. It was everything. "Look at this armor," Colonel General Alfred Jodl sneered, reading from the intelligence report. 51 millimeters at the front. Our Panther has 80 millimeters sloped. The Tiger? 100 millimeters of pure Krupp steel. He paused for effect. A single shot from our 88 millimeter gun would punch through this tin can like it's made of paper. The laughter intensified. What the Germans saw was a tank that seemed almost designed to lose. The Sherman stood tall, too tall, making it an easy target on any battlefield. Its 75 millimeter gun was adequate against infantry and light vehicles, but against German heavy armor? It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. The Sherman's gasoline engine was prone to catching fire when penetrated so prone that Allied crews had given it a nickname that sent chills down their spines. The Ronson, named after the cigarette lighter with the slogan, "Lights first time, every time." German tankers had their own name for it. Tommy Coker, the Tommy Cooker. "How many men crew this death trap?" someone asked. 5, came the reply. A somber silence fell for just a moment as the officers contemplated the fate of those 5 men inside a burning Sherman. Then Guderian waved his hand dismissively. "The Americans are fools if they think they can match the Panzer divisions with these," he declared. "They have no understanding of armored warfare. They're still thinking like the First World War, throwing bodies and machinery at the problem, hoping something sticks." He wasn't entirely wrong about American tank development. The United States had entered the war woefully unprepared in armored warfare. In 1940, the U.S. Army had fewer than 400 tanks, most of them obsolete. American tank doctrine was confused, splitting armor between infantry support and cavalry exploitation. The very concept of mass tank warfare, the Blitzkrieg that had shattered France in 6 weeks, was foreign to American military thinking. But what Guderian and his colleagues failed to grasp was something far more important than specifications and armor thickness. They failed to understand American industrial might. Detroit, Michigan. The same week, while German generals laughed in Berlin, something unprecedented was happening in America. The automobile capital of the world was transforming itself into the arsenal of democracy. The Fisher Body Plant, which once produced Cadillacs, now churned out M4 Shermans. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, built from scratch in just 7 months, was operating at full capacity. Ford's River Rouge complex, the largest integrated factory in the world, had retooled its assembly lines. But it wasn't just Detroit. The American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, a company that built trains, was producing tanks. The Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, another train manufacturer, had become one of the largest tank producers in the world. The Presteel Car Company, the Federal Machine and Welder Company, the Pacific Car and Foundry Company all across America, factories were converting to tank production at a pace the world had never seen. On the factory floor of the Chrysler Arsenal, the noise was deafening. Sparks flew from welding stations. Massive presses stamped out armor plates. Assembly lines moved with mechanical precision. And the workers, many of them women, their hair wrapped in bandanas, their sleeves rolled up, worked with fierce determination. These weren't soldiers. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, Rosie the Riveters, building the instruments of liberation. William Knutson, former president of General Motors, and now director of the Office of Production Management, walked through the factory floor with a military officer. The officer shouted over the din, How many can you produce? Knutson's answer was simple. How many do you need? By 1942, American factories were producing one Sherman tank every hour. By 1943, that number would increase. The production target seemed impossible. 50,000 tanks. The Germans were still laughing. Eastern Front, 1,943. A frozen hell. German Panzer Commander Otto Carius sat in his Tiger tank, scanning the snow-covered landscape through his periscope. He'd already destroyed 14 Soviet tanks in the past month. The Tiger was invincible, or so it seemed. But there was a problem. One that kept commanders like Carius awake at night. For every Tiger tank Germany produced, they built only 1,347 during the entire war. For every Panther, around 6,000. These were masterpieces of engineering over-engineered, some would say. Each tank required thousands of man-hours to build. Specialized parts. Precision manufacturing. The Tiger's transmission alone was so complex that it frequently broke down. The Panther's engine was prone to catching fire. Both tanks guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. Fuel that Germany was increasingly running short of. And here was the terrible arithmetic of war. When a Tiger broke down, and they often did, it required a specialized recovery vehicle and skilled mechanics. When a Tiger was destroyed, it represented an irreplaceable loss of resources, time, and expertise. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Sherman tanks were rolling off assembly lines like automobiles. The German generals had focused on quality. The Americans had chosen quantity. But it was more than just quantity. The Sherman had something the German tanks lacked: reliability. Its engine was simple, borrowed from civilian trucks and tractors. Its transmission was robust. Any mechanic with basic training could repair it. Its parts were standardized and interchangeable. When a Sherman broke down, it could be fixed in hours. When it was destroyed, 10 more were already on ships crossing the Atlantic. The Sherman had another advantage the Germans hadn't considered: logistics. It was light enough to cross bridges that would collapse under a Tiger. It could be transported by ship, by rail, by truck. It didn't require specialized equipment to move it. It ran on gasoline, which was readily available, not diesel, which was scarce. The Americans had designed their tank not just for battle, but for war, for the long, grinding industrial struggle that modern warfare had become. And they were about to prove it. The 6th of June, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The ramp of the landing craft dropped, and Sergeant Alex Thompson saw hell. Machine gun fire tore through the air. Mortars exploded in geysers of sand and water. Men fell before they even reached the beach. Through the chaos, through the deafening roar of artillery and screaming, Thompson heard a sound that filled him with hope. The deep rumble of tank engines. The first Shermans were coming ashore. Some immediately bogged down in the sand. Others were hit by German anti-tank guns, erupting in flames. But more came, and more, and more. Within hours, dozens of Shermans had reached the beach. By the end of the day, hundreds were ashore. Within a week, thousands were rolling through the hedgerows of Normandy. The invasion of Europe had begun, and at its spearhead were the very tanks the Germans had mocked. In his command post 20 miles inland, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, received the reports. His face went pale as he read the numbers. "How many tanks?" he asked. "Thousands, Herr Feldmarschall, and more arriving every hour." Rommel set down the report and looked out the window toward the coast. For the first time since the invasion began, he understood the magnitude of what was happening. The Americans hadn't come to fight fair. They'd come to win, and they'd brought an army of steel with them. Normandy, France, July 1944. Lieutenant Jake Morrison had been in his Sherman for 6 hours straight, and every muscle in his body was screaming. The hedgerows of Normandy, those ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, had turned into a nightmare labyrinth where death waited around every corner. "Contact, 88, 2 o'clock. The words every Sherman crew dreaded. The German 88mm gun was a legend of terror. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, it had been adapted into the most feared anti-tank gun of the war. At 1,000 yards, it could punch through the Sherman's frontal armor like it wasn't even there. And the worst part? You rarely saw it before it fired. The shell hit Morrison's Sherman with the sound of a thunderclap. Metal screamed. The tank shuddered violently, but miraculously, the shell glanced off the sloped front armor. "Back up! Back up!" Morrison yelled into his radio. They reversed behind the hedgerow just as a second shell tore through the space they'd occupied a second before. Morrison's hands were shaking. His loader, a kid from Iowa named Danny Miller, was white as a sheet. "We can't fight that," Miller whispered. "We can't win against that." Morrison knew he was right. In a one-on-one fight, the Sherman lost to German heavy armor almost every time. The statistics were brutal. It took an average of 5 Shermans to destroy 1 German Panther or Tiger. 5 crews, 25 men, risking their lives. The Germans called it the death ratio. But what the Germans didn't understand, what Morrison was about to show them, was that the Americans weren't planning to fight fair. 10 minutes later, the same battlefield. Morrison's tank wasn't alone. It was part of a platoon. The platoon was part of a company. The company was part of a battalion. And the battalion was part of the largest mechanized force ever assembled. "All units, this is Bulldog 6. The company commander's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got 1 Tiger holding up the advance. Here's what we're going to do." The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. 2 Shermans would approach from the front, drawing the Tiger's attention, and fire. While the German tank was focused on them, 3 more Shermans would flank from both sides, hitting the Tiger from angles where its armor was thinner. If the first wave failed, a second wave was already moving into position. If the second wave failed, a third was ready. "That's suicide for the lead tanks," Miller said quietly. Morrison gripped the radio handset. "Yeah, and we're lead tank number 1. The attack began at 1,400 hours. Morrison's Sherman and another broke cover, charging toward the Tiger's position. The German crew spotted them immediately. The Tiger's turret traversed with mechanical precision, that slow, deliberate movement that meant death was coming. The 88 fired. The shell caught the Sherman next to Morrison's tank, squarely in the turret. The explosion was instantaneous. The entire tank seemed to lift off the ground for a moment before crashing back down, already engulfed in flames. Morrison saw a hatch open, saw 1 man try to crawl out, saw him fall back into the inferno. 4 men dead in less than a second. "Keep moving!" Morrison screamed to his driver, even as his heart hammered in his chest. The Tiger was reloading those precious few seconds that meant life or death. The German commander had to make a choice. Finish off Morrison's damaged Sherman, or turn to face the 3 tanks now emerging from the hedgerows on his flanks. He chose Morrison. It was the wrong choice. 3 75mm shells slammed into the Tiger's side armor simultaneously. The first penetrated the engine compartment. The second hit the turret ring, jamming the turret. The third punched through into the crew compartment. The Tiger didn't explode in Hollywood fashion. It simply stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. The crew, those who could, bailed out, uniforms smoldering. Morrison's Sherman limped back to the rally point. Behind him, mechanics were already swarming another damaged Sherman, replacing a track that had been blown off. Beside that, a completely destroyed Sherman was being pushed off the road to make way for the advance. But even as Morrison watched 2 destroyed Shermans being cleared away, 5 more rolled up to replace them. That was the reality the Germans were confronting. For every Sherman they destroyed, and they destroyed thousands, 10 more appeared. The Americans could afford to trade 5 tanks for 1. They could afford the brutal mathematics of attrition. Germany could not. German headquarters, France. That evening, SS Oberfuhrer Michael Wittmann was a legend among panzer crews. With 138 tank kills to his name, He was one of the most decorated tank aces of the war. He destroyed dozens of Shermans personally, along with scores of other Allied vehicles. But tonight, as he met with other German commanders, the mood was grim. "We're running out of tanks," Colonel Hans von Luck said bluntly. "I started this campaign with 120 panzers. I'm down to 47, and no replacements are coming." "We're destroying their tanks at a rate of 5-1, Whitman protested. "How can we be losing?" Von Luck pulled out a map covered in red markers, each one representing a reported American armored unit. The map was nearly solid red. "Because they started with 5,000, and we started with 500, he said quietly. "Do the math." The silence in the room was suffocating. "There's more," Von Luck continued. "Our Tigers are breaking down faster than we can repair them. The transmissions are failing. We can't get spare parts. The factories are being bombed around the clock. We're cannibalizing broken tanks to keep operational ones running. And fuel." He shook his head. "We're rationing fuel so severely that some of our tanks can't even reach the battlefield." Whitman stared at the map. Each marker represented not just a tank, but a crew, a supply line, a factory back in America working 3 shifts a day. The scope of American production was becoming terrifyingly clear. "How many are they producing?" someone asked. "Intelligence estimates 2,000 per month. Maybe more." The number hung in the air, like a death sentence. Whitman had destroyed 138 tanks in his entire career, a career spanning years. The Americans were replacing that many in a single day. August 1944. The Falaise Gap. The German army in Normandy was collapsing. After weeks of grinding battles in the hedgerows, the Americans had finally broken through at a place called St. Lo. What followed was the largest mechanized pursuit in military history. Thousands of American tanks, half-tracks, and armored vehicles poured through the gap, racing across France. German forces tried to retreat through a narrow corridor near the town of Falaise. It became a killing ground. American Shermans lined the ridges above the pocket, their guns trained on the trapped German columns below. Fighter bombers circled overhead. Artillery rained down continuously. The Germans called it Der Kessel, the cauldron. Private First Class James Rodriguez sat in his Sherman, watching the devastation through his periscope. The road below was choked with destroyed German vehicles, tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, all jumbled together in a grotesque traffic jam of death. "There's so many of them," his gunner muttered. "And there's more of us," Rodriguez replied. A German Panther attempted to break through the American line. It was immediately engaged by 6 Shermans simultaneously. The Panther managed to destroy 2 before it was overwhelmed, burning shells tearing it apart from multiple angles. That was the new reality of armored warfare. German tank commanders, accustomed to hunting Allied tanks like prey, now found themselves the hunted. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and increasingly out of fuel and ammunition. September 1944. The numbers tell the story. By early September, American forces had liberated Paris and were racing toward the German border. The statistics of the campaign were staggering. The Germans had started with approximately 2,000 tanks in France. Fewer than 100 made it back to Germany. The Americans had landed over 4,000 Shermans in the first 3 months after D-Day alone. Thousands more were arriving every week. German tank production for all of 1,944. Around 19,000 tanks total. And that number included every model, from light tanks to Tigers, spread across all fronts. American tank production for 1,944. Over 17,000 Shermans alone, not counting other tank models, with 95% of them going to Europe. The numbers were overwhelming. But it wasn't just numbers. American tank crews were getting better. They'd learned to work together, to use their radios effectively, to coordinate combined arms attacks with infantry and artillery. They developed tactics specifically designed to counter German heavy armor. And they'd learned something else. The Sherman, despite its flaws, was a good enough tank. Not the best tank, but good enough, reliable enough, producible enough, Good enough to win. German-French border. October 1944. General Heinrich Eberbach stood at the border, watching the remnants of his panzer divisions limp home. These were the same units that had crushed France in 1940, that had nearly reached Moscow in 1941. Now they were ghosts. A single Tiger tank, one of only a handful that had survived the retreat, rumbled past, its armor scarred with dozens of impact marks. The crew looked hollow-eyed, exhausted. Eberbach thought back to that conference room in Berlin 2 years ago when they'd all laughed at the American tanks. The memory felt like it belonged to a different world. They'd been so sure, so confident in their technical superiority. They'd built the finest tanks in the world, masterpieces of engineering. But the Americans hadn't tried to build the finest tanks. They'd built 50,000 good-enough tanks. And now those tanks were at the German border, and there was nothing left to stop them. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The 16th of December, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The world exploded. Corporal Tommy Chen was asleep in his Sherman when the barrage began. Thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The ground shook. Trees disintegrated. The sky lit up with orange flashes. Hitler had launched his final gamble. Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge. Through the pre-dawn darkness, German panzers rolled forward Tigers, Panthers, and the new King Tigers, the most powerful tanks ever built. Some weighed 70 tons, with armor so thick that even at point-blank range, a Sherman shell would simply bounce off. The Germans had scraped together their last reserves, 2,000 tanks, 200,000 men, and nearly all their remaining fuel. This was their Hail Mary punch through the American lines. Reached the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in half. For 3 days, it worked. American units were overrun. Entire battalions surrendered. The Germans captured fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and hundreds of vehicles. Panzer columns drove deep into Allied territory, creating a massive bulge in the American lines. At a crossroads town called Bastogne, surrounded American forces desperately called for help. "We're cut off," the radio transmission crackled. "We need tanks, now." General George Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, did something unprecedented. He turned his entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, 90 degrees, and drove them north through a blizzard. "We'll be in Bastogne in 48 hours, Patton declared. His staff thought he was insane. You couldn't move an entire army that fast, not in winter, not through those conditions. But Patton understood something the Germans had forgotten. American logistics were unstoppable. The 22nd of December, 1944. The road to Bastogne. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez stood beside her supply truck, watching an endless column of Shermans roll past. She was part of the Red Ball Express, the truck drivers who kept the American war machine running. The trucks never stopped. Day and night, in sun and snow, they carried fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. When a Sherman broke down, parts arrived within hours. When one was destroyed, a replacement was already en route. "How many tanks are moving north?" a young private asked her. Vasquez looked at the columns stretching to the horizon. All of them. The German offensive had stunned the Americans, but it had also awakened a sleeping giant. Within days, Eisenhower redirected every available armored division toward the bulge. Shermans that had been resting, refitting, or in reserve were thrown into the battle. The Germans had committed 2,000 tanks to their attack. The Americans were bringing 5,000. The 26th of December, 1944. Bastogne. Lieutenant Morrison, now a veteran of 6 months of combat, saw Bastogne through the snow. His Sherman was one of the lead tanks in Patton's relief column. German panzers tried to stop them. At a place called Assinois, Morrison's company ran headlong into a defensive line of Panthers and Tigers. Contact. Multiple panzers, 500 yards. The Americans didn't slow down. They didn't maneuver. They charged straight ahead, guns blazing. Shermans exploded left and right. But the column kept coming. For every tank destroyed, 2 more took its place. The German line, designed to stop a cautious advance, was overwhelmed by sheer audacity and numbers. Morrison's tank took 3 hits, 1 glanced off, 1 jammed the turret, 1 killed his loader. But the engine kept running, the gun kept firing, and the tank kept moving forward. At 4:50 p.m., the first Shermans rolled into Bastogne. The siege was broken. German headquarters. The 28th of December, 1944. Field Marshal von Rundstedt stared at the situation map in disbelief. The bulge, which had been a triumphant spearhead just days ago, was now a death trap. "How many tanks have we lost?" he asked. "Over 600, Herr Feldmarschall. And we're abandoning another 400 due to fuel shortages." Von Rundstedt closed his eyes. 1,000 tanks, half their attacking force, gone. And for what? They'd advanced 40 miles, captured some towns, and now they were being pushed back by an American counteroffensive that seemed to have infinite resources. And American losses? "They've lost approximately 800 tanks, sir." Von Rundstedt almost laughed. "And how many replacements have they received?" The aide consulted his notes. "Intelligence reports over 1,200 new tanks have arrived in the theater in the past 2 weeks alone." There it was, the terrible arithmetic. Germany had thrown everything into this offensive. Every reserve, every last tank, every drop of fuel they could scrape together. They'd lost 1,000 tanks they could never replace. The Americans had lost 800 tanks and gained 400. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of German armored forces. They'd gambled everything and lost. January 1945, crossing into Germany. The American tanks rolled across the German border like a steel tsunami. The Siegfried Line, Hitler's supposedly impregnable defensive wall, crumbled under the weight of massed armor and artillery. Chen, still alive in his battered Sherman, crossed into German territory and saw something he'd never seen before. Abandoned German tanks. Not destroyed, abandoned. Out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of spare parts, simply left by the roadside. "They're not even fighting anymore," his driver said. "They can't," Chen replied. "They've got nothing left to fight with." By late January, the statistics told the story of annihilation. Germany's total operational tank strength on the Western Front, fewer than 2,000 tanks. American tank strength, over 15,000 Shermans, with more arriving daily. The Germans had designed and built the finest tanks in military history. The Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger. Masterpieces of engineering. But masterpieces don't win wars. Production wins wars. Logistics wins wars. The ability to replace losses, repair damage, and keep fighting when the enemy has nothing left, that wins wars. The German generals had laughed at the Sherman. They'd mocked its thin armor, its mediocre gun, its tall profile. But the Sherman had the last laugh, because 50,000 good enough tanks will always beat 10,000 perfect ones, especially when the perfect ones run out of fuel halfway to the battlefield. Berlin, April 1945. General Heinz Guderian stood in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, the same building where he'd once laughed at photographs of American tanks. The walls were cracked from Allied bombing. The windows were blown out. The sound of artillery, American and Soviet, echoed constantly in the distance. On the desk before him lay the final production reports. The numbers were devastating. Total German tank production, entire war, approximately 67,000 tanks of all types. Total American tank production, entire war, 88,410 tanks. 49,234 of them were Shermans. But the numbers only told part of the story. Guderian picked up another report, this one detailing tank losses. Germany had lost virtually every tank it had ever produced. Destroyed in combat, abandoned for lack of fuel, cannibalized for spare parts, or simply broken down beyond repair. The Americans? They'd lost thousands of Shermans. Yes, approximately 8,000 destroyed in Europe alone. But they'd produced 49,000. They still had over 40,000 operational tanks scattered across Europe and the Pacific. The difference wasn't just production. It was sustainability. A Tiger tank, that magnificent beast that could destroy 5 Shermans, required 300,000 man-hours to build, specialized parts that only a few factories could produce, constant maintenance by expert mechanics. 2. 5 times more fuel than a Sherman, a specialized 18-wheel recovery vehicle just to tow it when it broke down. A Sherman required 10,000 man-hours to build, standardized parts from dozens of factories, basic maintenance that any mechanic could perform, regular gasoline that was abundant, standard recovery equipment. Guderian had designed the tactics of Blitzkrieg Lightning War, fast, devastating strikes with massed armor. But Blitzkrieg required something Germany never had: the industrial capacity for a long war. The Americans had that capacity, and they'd used it to bury Germany under an avalanche of steel somewhere. In Germany, the 20th of April 1945, Sergeant Morrison's Sherman rolled through another German town. The white flags were everywhere now. Civilians stood in doorways, watching the endless column of American tanks with hollow eyes. Morrison had survived. Against all odds, through Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, he'd survived. His original crew hadn't. Danny Miller, the kid from Iowa, had died in the hedgerows. His gunner had been killed at Bastogne. He'd lost 2 drivers. But there had always been replacements. Always another crew member to fill the empty seat. That was the thing about the American war machine. It was designed for attrition, designed to absorb losses and keep functioning. Every Sherman had been built knowing it might be destroyed. Every crew member had been trained knowing they might be the 3rd or 4th person in that position. The Germans had trained elite crews for their elite tanks. When those crews died, they were irreplaceable. The Americans had trained adequate crews for adequate tanks. When those crews died and thousands did, there were always more. It was brutal. It was cold. It was the mathematics of industrial warfare. And it had won the war. The final accounting. By the 8th of May 1945 VE Day, the numbers painted a stark picture. German heavy tanks. Tigers. King Tigers. Panthers. Total produced, approximately 7,000. Survivors. Fewer than 100 operational. Average lifespan in combat, 6 to 8 weeks. Replacement rate, impossible to sustain. American Sherman tanks. Total produced, 49,234. Losses in Europe, approximately 8,000. Survivors, over 40,000. Average time to replace, 48 hours. Replacement rate, exceeded losses by 5 to 1. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the philosophy. The Germans had pursued perfection. They designed tanks that were engineering marvels, machines that, in the right circumstances, with expert crews and adequate support, were virtually unstoppable. Each tank was a craftsman's masterpiece. The Americans had pursued sufficiency. They designed a tank that was good enough, reliable enough, producible enough. Each tank was a factory product, stamped out like automobiles. In a short war, the German approach might have worked. In a long war of attrition, it was suicide. The legacy. Lieutenant Jake Morrison returned home to Nebraska in August 1945. He'd left as a farm boy who'd never seen a tank. He returned as a veteran who'd commanded one through the bloodiest battles in history. Years later, his grandson asked him about the Sherman tank. "Granddad, the books say it wasn't as good as the German tanks. Why did we win?" Morrison thought for a long moment. He thought about Danny Miller burning to death in a hedgerow. He thought about the friends he'd lost. He thought about the 5-to-1 ratio, the terrible cost of each German tank destroyed. Then he looked at his grandson and said, "The Sherman wasn't the best tank in the war, but it was the best tank for the war. It could cross oceans on ships, drive across bridges, be repaired by farm boys like me, run on fuel we had plenty of, and when one was destroyed, 10 more were already on their way. The Germans built masterpieces. We built what we needed to win. He paused, then added, "The Germans laughed at our tanks. But you know what? We drove those tanks all the way to Berlin, and they couldn't stop us." The museum. Present day. Today, you can find Sherman tanks in museums around the world. Many of them still run testament to their reliability. Beside them, occasionally, you'll find a tiger or a panther, lovingly restored but requiring constant maintenance. The plaques tell the story. The tiger, 1,347 produced. The panther, 6,000 produced. The Sherman, 49,234 produced. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The Sherman tank won World War II not because it was the best tank, but because America built it in quantities that made victory inevitable. Because American factories could outproduce German factories 10 to 1. Because American logistics could keep those tanks fueled, armed, and crewed, no matter how many were lost. Because American doctrine accepted the brutal arithmetic of attrition warfare and planned for it. The German generals had laughed at the Sherman in 1942. They'd mocked its armor, its gun, its height, its reliability. By 1945, those generals were surrendering to Sherman tank crews. 50,000 Shermans had rolled into Europe. They'd pushed through Normandy's hedgerows, broken the siege of Bastogne, crossed the Rhine, and ended the Third Reich. The Germans had built the finest tanks in the world, but the Americans had built enough tanks to win the war. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Epilogue. The lessons of steel. The story of the Sherman tank teaches us something profound about warfare, about engineering, and about success itself. Perfection is expensive. Perfection is slow. Perfection is fragile. Good enough, produced in overwhelming quantity, with reliable logistics and the ability to absorb losses, is unbeatable. The Germans designed tanks for a world that no longer existed. A world of limited warfare, of decisive battles, of quality over quantity. They built weapons for the last war, not the current one. The Americans designed tanks for the reality of modern industrial warfare. A brutal, grinding struggle, where victory goes, not to the best weapon, but to the nation that can replace its losses faster than it suffers them. Every Sherman lost represented a tragedy. 5 men who might die, who might burn, who might never see home again. But every Sherman lost could be replaced in 2 days. Every crew lost could be replaced in a week. Every tiger lost represented months of production that could never be recovered. Every expert crew lost represented years of training that couldn't be replicated. The German generals learned this lesson too late, in the ruins of their cities, surrounded by the very tanks they'd once mocked. 50,000 times they learned it. 50,000 Shermans rolled into Europe, and each one carried the same message. American industrial might was unstoppable. Not because each tank was perfect, but because there were always more tanks, more crews, more fuel, more ammunition. The factory workers in Detroit, the Rosie the Riveters, the mechanics, the logistics officers, the supply truck drivers, they won the war just as surely as the tank crews did. They understood something the German high command never grasped. Wars aren't won by the best weapons. They're won by enough weapons. And America had built enough.